This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 23 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry, and for today's episode, we will be doing a recommendations for the Week 6 waiver wire. Now, this will be a bit of a condensed episode just because, quite frankly, there's just not a lot of options ahead of the Week 6 waiver wire. So we'll have a few options when it comes to running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. But before we get started, I want to let you know that you can follow and interact with us on Twitter. We are at FFAlchemistPod. Again, it is at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show directly at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now let's get into the Week 6 waiver wire targets. At the running back position this week, there is one priority ad across ESPN leagues, and that's going to be Roschon Johnson of the Chicago Bears, currently at 37% ownership in ESPN leagues. Now, Khalil Herbert, who has had pretty strong running back one usage in weeks 4 and 5, he left week 5 with an injury, and I think the expectation is that it's going to be a multiple week injury for Khalil Herbert. So next up would be rookie Roschon Johnson. The problem is that Johnson also left week 5 with a concussion. Now, Johnson was playing about 30 to 40% of snaps with less than 10 opportunities per game in weeks 1 through 4. However, his per touch average has been pretty good. He's averaging almost 5 yards per carry, and he's actually a full yard better than Herbert when it comes to yards before contact. And as a receiver, Johnson was better in catch rate and better at targets per route run. If Johnson returns in week 6, he could be in line for a healthy workload. Now, as I mentioned, Johnson left week 5 with a concussion. If he is out in week 6, then it would be Deontay Foreman, who had been a healthy scratch for the last 2 weeks, but then he would become the appropriate waiver target in week 6. However, long term, if Herbert is missing multiple weeks, I would expect Johnson to at least be back by week 7 and getting that running back one workload for the Chicago Bears. Outside of Roschon Johnson, it's pretty slim pickings at the running back position, but I think a lot of people will point to the Cardinals' backfield in the event that James Conner is out with an injury. He left week 5 with a knee injury. It's to be determined how long he will be out, if at all. But if he is, it looks like undrafted rookie running back Amari DiMercato, hope I'm saying that right, currently less than 1% ownership in ESPN leagues, could be the beneficiary. I mean, you look at this running back roster. Conner, question mark, left with the injury. We don't know what he looks like going into week 6. Keontae Ingram, thought to be the backup. He left a few weeks ago with a neck injury. Corey Clement has been a healthy scratch. Marlon Mack has been on IR since, I think, a day after he got signed in the preseason. So this running back unit is pretty much a mash unit, and Amari DiMercato could just be the last man standing and could find his way into a healthy workload here in week 6. However, with that being said, this is really a backfield I would not target on the waiver wire. I think you would be pretty hard-pressed to find a scenario where DiMercato would find his way into your starting lineup. To me, he is nothing more than running back bench depth. I would much rather target running backs where if their incumbent starter got hurt, you would have significantly more value than what DiMercato is offering you right now. Those are players such like, I'm thinking, Zach Charbonnet, who's currently at 37%. Kenny Gainwell, also at 37%. And then even more importantly of the group, Tajay Spears of the Titans, currently owned only in 25% of ESPN leagues. All three of those guys I would rank as priority ads ahead of anyone in the Cardinals' backfield. Now flipping to the wide receiver unit, instead of DiMercato at running back for the Cardinals, I think the alternative option might actually be Cardinals wide receiver Rondale Moore. Now Moore had 3 carries for 50 yards in week 5 on top of his additional receiving work. And historically, Rondale Moore has consistently played around the line of scrimmage, and he's shown big playability, right? Through 5 weeks, Moore has averaged over 15 yards per carry on a very small sample. He has less than 10 carries. But if we can combine backfield opportunities with a handful of targets, Rondale Moore could be the sneaky waiver wire ad while James Conner is out. Now, coming off the bye week, Quentin Johnston is one of my higher priority ads at the wide receiver position. Johnston, the rookie first rounder, hasn't played enough to be fantasy relevant yet. Now, he entered the season as wide receiver 4 on the depth chart, but with the season-ending injury to Mike Williams, the Chargers are likely forced to accelerate his usage. Now, the Chargers are also top 10 in the league in pass attempts, and they're coming off a bye week in which they had the opportunity to incorporate Johnston more into their weekly game plan. But the main reason for the waiver recommendation is his ceiling is just so much higher than all the other waiver options this week. If nothing comes of it, and Quentin Johnston continues to have 50% snap participation and 3 targets, you can drop him in a week or two. But he has the highest range of outcomes on the waiver wire this week for the wide receiver position, and that's why I would prioritize Quentin Johnston. Another highly drafted player with little game experience is Lions wide receiver Jameson Williams. Now, it was announced earlier in the week that the Lions were going to basically put him on a pitch count. They wanted to slowly work him back, coming off the hamstring injury that took him out in the preseason. Then, of course, he was ineligible to play anyway due to the gambling thing, but that's behind us now. Anyway, in week 5, Williams only got 3 targets on 15 routes run. Right? He barely played out of 11 personnel, and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jahmyr Gibbs, they weren't playing either. So I think it's noteworthy given his draft capital, given his pedigree and his talent, but right now he's still, I think, at best, the 5th option from a fantasy pecking order right now on the Lions team. So Jameson Williams is available in 60% of leagues, but I would put him as a low priority ad. And then the last option at the wide receiver group will be Vikings wide receiver KJ Osborne, currently owned in only 22% of leagues. Now, obviously, this is conditional depending on how long Justin Jefferson will be out. He left the Week 5 game with a hamstring injury, did not return. And KJ Osborne in that event, I think, is a viable streaming option. Now, the Vikings are among the league leaders in passing attempts through 5 weeks, and Osborne is second on the team in snaps and routes run. And now, while his snap and route participation has been quite high, he's earned very little in the way of targets. His target per route run rate was bordering on 10% for the season. But he also plays opposite of Justin Jefferson. If Jefferson isn't there, I think it's reasonable to expect Osborne's target volume to increase. And then lastly, at the tight end position, I have 2 recommendations this week. The first is going to be Commanders tight end Logan Thomas, currently owned in only 8% of ESPN leagues. Now, Thomas logged his best fantasy game of the year in week 5, 11 targets. He caught 9 of them for 77 yards. He got a touchdown. However, I would actually be a little bit cautious on expectations going forward. You see, in that game, the Commanders had 11 different players that got a target in week 5, and Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson are unlikely to combine for a 20% target share in future games either. On top of that, the Commanders completely abandoned the run for more than half of the game due to falling behind so quickly. Now, on the other hand, a tight end who gets 11 targets and 20 fantasy points, that can't be ignored either. If you are streaming tight ends at this point, Thomas should be your target for the week. And then lastly, I'm recording this Monday late afternoon before the Monday Night Football game between the Packers and the Raiders, but I'm going to continue to put Luke Musgrave on the waiver wire target list. He's currently at 23% owned. Now, Musgrave left the Week 4 game early with a concussion. However, from weeks 1 through 3, Musgrave was leading the team in snaps and routes and was 3rd on the team in targets, getting a target on a 5th of his routes run. I still think Musgrave is primed for a breakout at the tight end position. That'll wrap up episode 23 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure you like and subscribe as we will have more episodes drop this week. Tomorrow we'll do a full recap of key observations and trends from around the league in week 5, and then we'll get ready for week 6 with some recommendations on players you should not be afraid to start. So for Dustin Chandry, signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.